remove the need for a teacher altogether. It's a little scarier and it's moving a lot faster. I don't think when you're dealing with children, you're going to disintermediate teacher from that experience. In the higher ed space, the ability of AI to grade assignments quickly and fairly has enormous implications. There's a ton of research that says if you can give students feedback quickly, it enhances the learning experience tremendously, right? So it's not even a screen intermediated application. It's listening to the kids talk about a topic and then helping guide the conversation that they're having with themselves. The opportunity and the concern is this idea that you're going to have kind of a perfect AI.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of This Is M&A. My next guest is a managing director over at Tyton Partners, where he leads education-focused M&A across the global knowledge sector. He's been at the center of this industry for more than 25 years, first on Wall Street as a top equity analyst, and then working with Tyton. He's been recognized as one of the 25 most influential people in the career college sector. He's also testified before the U.S. Commission on the Future of Higher Education and has authored several white papers on public policy in higher education. He holds a BA from Yale University, an MBA from Harvard Business School. In his spare time, like myself, he's a dog lover. He spends lots of his time walking his 6-year-old lab. With that, let's go ahead and welcome Trace Urdan. Welcome.
Hey, Stephen, good to be here. I'm glad you mentioned the lab. So in case we get interrupted by any barking, people will understand what that's all about.
Definitely. And I'm sure a lot of my listeners, they're either dog lovers or cat lovers, one of the two. So with that being said, why don't we go ahead and jump in? I'm happy to have you. Really looking forward to the discussion that we're about to have because it's a bit unique and we'll talk about that here shortly. But we're going to dive into making sense of turmoil in education where M&A and strategy tend to collide. So the education sector, as we all know, is in flux, right? From nonprofit colleges under financial stress to EdTech startups chasing AI to shifting regulations that can make or break valuations literally overnight. It's one of the most complex markets for dealmakers right now. And so what we're going to do is we're going to try to unpack that a bit. And so we're going to focus on 3 core topics. One, which is nonprofit consolidation and the human side of deals, right? Why these transactions are unlike anything else in corporate M&A. We're going to touch on AI in education, kind of the hype versus the scalable strategy of it, how to kind of separate the winners from the noise, which is what our podcast tries to do. We try to work through the noise and get to the raw content. And then we're going to talk about policy, right? When policy meets the market. So how regulation drives timing and valuation in ways most investors tend to overlook. So with that being said, we do have a ton to unpack here. We hope to get through all of it. I think you and I had a previous discussion where this is going to be hard to get through, but we're going to do our darndest to make that happen. What's interesting, Trace, is your focus on education, right? One of the topics that we chat about was the nonprofit side of it, right? And that's a bit unique. It adds an interesting wrinkle. So why don't we just start there first?
Yeah, great, Stephen. As you mentioned, I've been working in education, the intersection of education and finance for more than 25 years. I love it. There's so many different elements. You touched on several of the themes we're dealing with now, but you've got the intersection of tech, you've got public policy concerns, you've got, research, you've got every kind of business model. So it's really what's drawn me to the group. One of the areas that we're seeing growth in, and it's a little bit unfortunate, but there, as you mentioned at the top, there are a bunch of pressures on colleges and universities. Most of that comes from sort of shifting demographics and the fact that there just aren't as many students as there were, and definitely not as many affluent students who are able to pay full freight. Add to that the challenges associated with online education, some of the policy changes that we've been seeing at the federal level. Traditional colleges and universities are under tremendous pressure. And it's a new thing for them because they've only, the people that are running these schools have only ever known growth. As I'm sure your listeners can appreciate, the whole world is better when everything is growing. It's when stuff starts to contract that you get real challenges. And so we've already begun, but it's going to intensify a wave of consolidation among traditional colleges and universities, and they're really not well equipped for it at all. Historically, these kinds of institutions have just sort of called up the college across the street, and if they wanted to merge and sort of done deals that way, maybe with the help of some lawyers. But we're entering a new era. And so folks like us that work in the world of M&A add real value to the process. But that said, it's a really unusual sector because you're not dealing in general with valuation and price, and you don't have the discipline of price to drive the transaction forward. In general, you're dealing with all kinds of sort of extraneous issues that are of concern to various stakeholders, governance, sort of what's going to happen, branding, alumni. There are all kinds of side issues, which in a normal M&A deal would be pretty peripheral, but with a nonprofit, especially in the world of colleges and universities, becomes central to the negotiation, and it can make it very, very complex.
What, I guess, just thinking about nonprofit, and you kind of hinted on this a little bit, but what are some other ways that makes consolidation so different than, I guess, traditional corporate M&A?
You do have change of control. So there is always technically a buyer and a seller, right? There is an institution that's more dominant in the transaction, but they don't like to look that square in the face. So everything is, you have to use a lot of language like partnership and affiliation and that kind of thing. And the questions around how much independence will the institution being subsumed have? Will its traditions be kept in place? Will some of its brands be kept in place? Of course, staff and programs. It's inevitable that if a school needs to be acquired, there's something that they're doing that the market is not responding to. That generally means that they're probably offering programs that they shouldn't be offering or that aren't competitive in the market anymore. So you have to kind of tackle all of that stuff in the M&A process up front. So, like I said, it isn't like, well, we're going to buy your assets or your equity for X amount of money and, presto changeo. It's like all of these little items become the central items, and they all have to be included in the documentation. And then they all have to get signed off on both by accreditors and generally the Department of Education. And it just, it means that it can be very dicey, and dealing with people's personalities and concerns and personal concerns becomes really central to the whole process.
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic. I'm learning real time. I'm a student of business, and the education in the nonprofit space is definitely not my sweet spot. So I'm learning real time with you here. So thinking about questions just from curiosity aspect, I'm just curious. I would think culture is so important in these types of transactions. It's already important across most industries and M&A in general. You got to make sure culture aligns. But here, I feel like it's elevated even more so, right? That's a huge component of it. Can you just talk about that, like culture, how that might have been close to derailing some of the deals you've worked on, or the governance side of it, right? Things like that might have derailed some deals. Do you have any battle scars from that you can speak to?
100%. Culture and mission are enormously important. One of the areas of friction that we deal with is that you often have institutions that are happy to be buyers, can be for-profit schools, which are, generally more disciplined, at least on a financial basis, and can evaluate opportunities and are ready to lean in. But there are lots and lots of nonprofit institutions that really don't want to become part of a for-profit institution. So there's a culture clash right there.
Yeah, you kind of got to balance. I feel like there's a balancing act there, right? Mission alignment, but also financial realities that you're dealing with.
Yeah, well, in our business, we have a saying, which is that there's no money, there's no mission, right? So you do have to balance those things out. But, without naming names and not dragging us into too sensitive areas, but, over the last several years, questions of DEI have been huge, right? We've had institutions that are really, really focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that has been a central area that they want to be reassured about. This is sort of pre-vibe shift stuff. That's been something that we've dealt with before and had deals not come together because we've had clients that have been concerned that the entity that they were going to merge with didn't have a sufficient level of concern over those issues. So, just to give you a sense of how delicate some of these discussions can be. And I know every kind of M&A transaction deals with delicate issues, but the big difference is you don't have value as something to focus the mind in a typical M&A transaction. And we do those as well, right? We do buy and sell companies. So, in those situations, the price becomes a really central, point of focus. It helps you get through some of those other issues, right? And when you don't have that as a central concern, all of these other stakeholder issues become more important.
I could see that happening. I'm going to shift gears for a second here. We could come back to this topic more in depth if we need to, but I can't stop thinking about AI and the role it plays in education or doesn't play, right? I was at, what was the event? Create the Future 2025. A friend of mine, Sean Flynn, shout out to that guy, great person. He throws the event, and there's a speaker there, and we're talking about education and AI, and it was related to, it feels like the education system hasn't kept up with the speed in which people can learn, because we have so much more at our fingertips. Like, to get a bachelor's degree still takes the same amount of time. To get a master's, it still takes the same amount of time. But the rate in which we can consume information has drastically changed. And I know I didn't prep you for this question, and most of them I didn't prep you for, but I'd love to get your insights on that. What are your thoughts on that? Should school really take 4 years to get a bachelor's degree, or should it take a year now, right? To get your master's?
No,
how
listen,
long should that take, right?
that's a terrific question. And it's an example of areas where regulatory apparatus that was put in place to do a bunch of things, right? Guarantee quality in the case of accreditation, protect taxpayers in the case of, where the federal government is loaning money to students to go to school. None of these apparatuses have kept up with, as you say, with sort of how students learn. And in my career, I've seen just the advent of online and how painful just the acceptance of online as a way in which people can learn has failed to keep up, and how the regulations have been just slow always to adapt to that. And you're right, of course, AI and the ability to sort of speed up learning plays a huge role there. And I think one of the things that's interesting now is this financial pressure we were discussing before should help this challenge, right? Because now there are a bunch of financial constraints on schools. You've also had the federal government make some changes into how readily available loan dollars are going to be to students in certain areas. And so there's pressure both to reduce the cost of education and to reduce the cost of delivering education. And I think those pressures are going to finally help these questions. In Europe, basically everywhere outside the US, a bachelor's degree is a 3-year degree, right? So that's almost a gimme, right? It's like, of course we can bring the cost down for students and still deliver a quality product in 3 years versus 4. And so I do feel like some of that stuff is changing in real time. And I think you'll see a lot of those things come out of these pressures that we were talking about.
It'll be interesting to see how that starts to unfold and evolve, even from just the educational, because we are more, there has been a shift. The pandemic created the shift. All those people that delayed on, hey, I'm not going to meet online, I'm going to meet in person, or, education online wasn't as well received. Now it's shifted aggressively. It forced that hand. I think we're going to start to see where AI is going to start having bots. And if it hasn't already, I mean, it probably already has. There's probably professors that you can now say, I'm going to start a school and my professors are going to be AI agents. Hopefully I don't offend any professors, but
well, listen, I mean, listen, I think all those things are coming, and we've seen a lot of that in the K-12 space. There are some really interesting models. I think one of the things that happened was in COVID really blew up sort of delivery models for education, and you have parents that are much more open to alternative methods of instruction than they were before the pandemic. A whole separate topic as to why that is. But yeah, we've seen a lot of models emerge. In higher education, it's more complicated because you have things like accreditation, you have things like student loans. So they're slower to change, but I do think that's coming. In the meantime, I mean, listen, AI and tech, some of it is generational, right? I've been doing this long enough that I've seen, certainly in the K-12 system, you've seen the retirement of a whole generation of teachers, basically greatest generation teachers retire and get replaced by people who are much more open to technology. And so some of it is just that, right? It's just getting younger people into positions of decision making to move some of this stuff along. But there are really, there are really interesting applications of AI that are already in place. As much as we've been talking about how slow education is to change, the reality is that there's some really cool things that are being adopted and are making a difference in real time. In the higher ed space, the ability of AI to grade assignments quickly and fairly has enormous implications. There's a ton of research that says if you can give students feedback quickly, it enhances the learning experience tremendously, right? If you have to wait for 3 weeks or whatever to get your paper back or your assignment back, you've already forgotten everything about that, and none of the feedback means anything. And then, you think about a TA grading a paper for 50 students, and you think about how good their feedback is on paper number 1 that they grade versus paper number 50 that they grade. And the ability of AI to apply sort of even standards in that is an actual improvement. And on the K-12 side, AI is exciting because the holy grail in K-12 education has always been to try to, how do you corral 30 students in a class where you're meeting everybody where they need to be met? It's so hard for a single teacher to accomplish that, right? They have to be superheroes to do that effectively. And there are plenty of teachers that are, but it's hard. And the ability of AI to tailor learning experiences to each individual child, we're already seeing applications in the classroom right now that are helping teachers to do that, right? To give students that need more time and attention what they need. The applications are enormous. And the good news is that the people who operate in those areas, they sort of get that, and as much as there are problems that people are nervous about with AI, like students not writing their own papers and that kind of thing, there are enormous benefits and they're already kind of in play.
Definitely. No, it makes a lot of sense. You and I have had previous conversations. In fact, right before we jumped on, I was telling you about my 4-year-old, right? And my wife and I are a difference of opinions of what we're going to do education-wise.
Sure.
She's all about public schools, and I used to be, but I'm like a lot of families out there where I'm shifting towards in-home, right, education. And part of what we're going to be utilizing is AI to help guide us in that process so that my wife and myself can educate my 4-year-old when she goes into kindergarten. Now, I'm kind of balanced where it's like, I don't plan on in-homing for, K through 12. It's probably just for a couple of years and then introduce her into public schooling just so that we can build more values and things like that in the home before she goes out, and you kind of mold her brain a little bit further before she goes out and starts learning from other families through their children. Because even through preschool, I've noticed sometimes she comes home. The other day, she called me dude, right? I'm like, whoa. I'm not dude. I don't know what kid you talk to, but dad's not dude, right? So,
well, I mean, listen, the good news for you is that, you go back 10 years or 15 years and, is either you go to a public school, a private school, or you do it homeschooling, and the enormous amount of work that requires. Now, as I mentioned, there's sort of all kinds of new models emerging. There are micro schools. There are, there's sort of supplemental things like you can teach your child at home, but also have help, right, from third-party providers and all kinds of startup businesses that are popping up to help address exactly this issue that you're describing, right? Which is that we want to do something more bespoke than sending our kid to the local public school, but we're also nervous about how much work and effort will be required to do it all at home. And there are responses to that from the EdTech world and from the education startup world that are emerging to help parents in your situation.
Well, we're about to be in the thick of trying to identify, is it public, is it private, is it home, is it a blend, is it some of these other models that you're referring to? So I might lean in and pick your brain at a later date on that. So let's shift to AI in a pitch book. I mean, in a pitch deck. It's in every pitch deck nowadays, right? Yep. AI enabled companies, how they're using AI both as a company to operate their business, but also how they're weaving an AI into their platforms, their products, their services. How do you, in the education space, how do you spot the real ones? Because there are some fake ones, right? It's like, oh, we're doing this with AI, and you really look into it, and it's like, that's not quite what you're doing, right? So how do you spot that?
Well, listen, I mean, it's sort of what we do. It's not dissimilar from the sort of the prior emergence of tech and tech-enabled, right? It's like, okay, is the tech doing something that matters? Is it not doing something that matters? What's the leverage that you're getting from it? And the AI model that applies there as well to sort of what you're describing of rooting out the real stuff. I think what's interesting for me to see in AI in the startup realm versus sort of entrenched players is how rapidly everything is moving. And in the past, you had a lot of ed tech startups that would go directly to market. They were doing something unique. and they build out a distribution system, whether in higher ed or in K-12, to sort of sell the virtues of what it is that they're doing to enhance, whether it's a back office issue with schools or a front of the house in the classroom with schools, and they'd sort of create a sales force to go out and sell that. AI is moving too quickly, right? The main thing, that I see and try to advise people is like, listen, if you've built something that is unique or an enhancement, focus on the tech, focus on the product and get that right. Don't worry about all the other stuff, because the reality is that at the end of the day, you're going to be in a much better position flipping that company to a larger entrenched player who has credibility with the buyer group, right? So going back to what we were talking about before, one of the things that makes the schooling world or the education world different is just the sort of how entrenched the decision makers are in those environments, right? It's different from corporate. It really is. So you have to, the ability of Houghton Mifflin, for example, to introduce, we call them HMH now, the ability of HMH to introduce a new technology into the classroom is going to be so much better and more effective than the ability of some startup who's calling on the school independently. And that has not always been the case. In sort of older versions of EdTech, that I would have argued the opposite, right? That HMH is the last place you want to go. But the reality is that AI is moving so quickly. It's so scary. There's so many different ways in which it impacts the teaching and learning experience that kind of the best version of these things that I've seen has been a partnership. HMH is not going to necessarily create the new applications effectively on their own, but boy, they are the right ones to bring it. And I'm just using them as an example. There's Pearson, McGraw-Hill, there's a million of these guys, but you know what I'm talking about. So anyway, that's a little bit of what makes it is very analogous to the emergence of EdTech, but it's a little bit different in that it's a little scarier and it's moving a lot faster. And so the time from startup to sale is abbreviated or collapsed.
Definitely. And what's interesting is it's accelerating so quickly, but we haven't even seen the generation who grew up in AI yet.
Right.
We're just scratching the surface. What about when that's
going to be your daughter, man?
Exactly. She's going to be the prime example of that. It's just scary how much further this is going to advance us. And looking at it through both lenses, the pros and the cons, right? So I know there's trade-offs between the two. Have you seen any strategies per se in the AI EdTech space that really scaled fast? And then as a piggyback to that, trying to figure out how to frame this, what's hype? Like, have you seen anything on the flip side? Have you seen anything where you're like, that's just a bunch of noise. That's just hype at this stage. That's not going to scale. So I guess maybe if you want to answer both or one or the other.
Yeah, I'll take a crack at it. And I don't have perfect insights here. I'm not sure anybody does, but both the opportunity and the concern is this idea that you're going to have kind of a perfect AI instructor, right? That's going to remove the need for a teacher altogether, right? Where you just interact with the bot. The bot is tailored to your needs and it provides that instruction in a really holistic way. To some extent, both the fear of that and the excitement of that, depending on which side of the fence you're on, that's a little bit overblown. Like, I don't think when you're dealing with children, you're going to disintermediate the live human teacher
Agreed.
from that experience. That said, the point I made before about being able to be with each child and catering to their needs at the same time, that is something that AI enhances. So for example, one of the coolest things that I've seen as sort of a startup, and I hate to be constantly talking about HMH, but it was sort of top of mind, but it was an acquisition that HMH made where basically the AI unit sits and listens to the kids in small group discussions and participates with them in the discussion. So it's not even a screen intermediated application. It's listening to the kids talk about a topic and then helping guide the conversation that they're having with themselves in small group settings. Now, that's something a teacher would ideally want to do with each of those groups, or wander around the classroom and try to kind of do it for all the kids at the same time, but obviously can't be as effective as a dedicated unit. That to me is super exciting. It is something that you can see really potentially moving the needle for the learning experience for students in real time. So, that's the thing. Same thing, if you look at the higher education world, the analog is counseling, right? So you've seen the ability of a bot to give students important information about their experience, to have it all unified. So it's like, how am I going to get my parking ticket paid? And am I taking the right classes? Am I going to be able to fulfill the requirements of my major on time, with this set of classes, right? So now the way that information gets conveyed to students is really choppy and ineffective. And even if it's delivered by a live human being, is not necessarily always accurate, right? Because sometimes these things are complex. The ability of a bot to do that is huge. While at the same time, the human being can deal with the student in a human way over human issues, right? That's the ideal. You want the counselor to be talking with your student about what their real concerns are, more than you need them to be the expert on, am I taking the right classes to fulfill my major within the time horizon that I've, been granted, right? And so it basically, in these situations where AI frees up the human being to be more human, that's the holy grail, I think. That's the future. The replacement of the human, I mean, maybe, but I think that's the part that's a little bit overhyped in both directions, both among its fans and among its the people who are afraid of it.
I err on the side where I think AI is going to do a lot more than what we anticipated.
That's
especially
probably fair.
Right. Especially given meetings are recorded now. And so there's so many things that it can learn and sources that it can learn from. But I do believe it's not going to replace the human element. I think it's going, to your point, free them up so they can do more human interactions. But I think it needs human oversight. People learn through hand gestures, how we lean in, how my eyebrows go up and down, your smile, observing what goes on around what the teacher's doing as she's going through the room, the eye-to-eye contact. Those are just things that you can't supplement for. You need a real person for. But also you want that interpersonal experience anyway, right? We have to have that. So I think there's going to be a balance that gets striked where, yes, do you need 5 people to do a job? No, you need 1 for every 10. And then there's going to be new jobs that open up as a result of that. But it'll be interesting to see where this goes. What I do believe is that if you're not a company or a person that's embracing AI, you're going to get left behind. There is no world for you going forward. I think that is the huge shift that's going to happen, and it's already happening. Companies are just leaning in aggressively on it, and you don't want to be left behind. I think there was a quote someone gave that was, way more important than I am on it, but it was basically, don't get left behind because of AI. Learn it, grab it by the reins, and learn as much as you can and move forward. So with all that being said, let's pivot, because I want to focus on regulation a bit, because in your world, that can derail a deal. And so maybe if you can talk to that, how often do you see where regulation or policy changes have changed valuations overnight or even blew up a deal potentially, right?
Well, listen, yeah. So that's one of the elements of working in education in general that makes it different from some other sectors, right? So you have just funding, right? So a lot of companies that operate in the K-12 space are trying to sell into public schools. The public schools have funding from a lot of different sources, state, local, and federal, and they're dedicated to different things. And the rules about how the dollars get spent can vary. And every time there's changes in federal policy, it makes everybody super nervous. So we've seen a lot of anxiety there. So, we saw deals that were right on the 1 yard line got blown up following the election because people were nervous about whether the dollars that were directed from federal sources into schools were going to be interrupted in some way. The federal dollars in K-12 education are relatively small as a percentage of the total, but as a percentage of the discretionary dollars that get spent on things like EdTech products, they're disproportionately high.
Right.
So the good news there is that we got through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and the K-12 dollars really were not interrupted in any meaningful way. And their direction is largely statutory, meaning that the Congress lays out how those dollars get allocated. So there's still concern that maybe the Department of Education is going to go away and how are the dollars going to flow down? But people are feeling much more sanguine that there's not going to be any significant interruption. There's some peripheral programs that got cut that people care about, but for the most part, it really has been a story of people clutching up and getting scared. And then now we're starting to see that, those deals open up again. Higher ed is way more complicated. It is because student loan dollars are so important to how universities fund themselves, and there's so many rules associated with those student loan dollars. It makes things very complicated. I've seen whole business models, over the last 10 years, we've seen the emergence of an entire sector devoted to helping traditional colleges and universities bring programs online. Online program managers, OPMs, they call them. And there was a point during the Biden administration where there was a fear that the administration was going to really, with the flick of a pen, completely upend that business model because it relied on revenue sharing with colleges and universities. And that made a lot of people uncomfortable. They didn't like the idea of private companies sharing in revenue that was basically coming from student loan dollars. That concern sort of went away again with the election, but it could come back. So that's an example of how, a whole entire, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of business that could get completely blown up through the sort of ideas of a policymaker, not even by Congress. So these things are hugely important. And then you get into for-profit colleges and universities, and that's a whole other topic right there. You've had a situation for the last 15 years where one side of the aisle had a great deal of animus towards that sector, and the other side of the aisle was much more favorable. And we've seen the pendulum swing back and forth, and it's impacted, basically what those businesses are worth swings wildly based on who the president is. That ultimately all of us at work in this sector would love to see that get resolved one way or the other, no matter what the right answer is.
Just give us some certainty here, right?
Just give us certainty. Yeah, that's exactly right. We're getting closer to that, but it's still an area where there's a lot of concern. Listen, it's part of why I have always been interested in the sector, because it's a whole nother wrinkle of sort of trying to analyze like what the public policy aspects are that are going to affect the companies that operate in the space and what they're worth and who wants to buy them and all the rest of it.
Right. We'll have to tie up. Last question, and it's more broader than just the space, the EdTech space and your focus, but just other sectors. Do you think other sectors kind of underestimate the risk of policy, or what have you seen just more broadly? If you have a comment on it, if not, understood.
It's funny because my entire career in finance has always really been, except for sort of a brief time I worked in publishing world, I've really been focused on this education thing where public policy is huge. But I don't think there's a single industry where there aren't implications that flow down from public policy. And so I can't imagine looking at any sector and not having a kind of a complex understanding of, who cares about this sector from a public policy space and what are the implications. It's funny, I've been doing this long enough that when I started, education was this area that was thought to be incredibly bipartisan, right? It was thought that everybody felt the same way. Every member of Congress had a college or university in their district, and, everybody kind of was in the same page. And I've seen the kind of the partisanship that we've seen in lots of other parts of life has kind of infected this sector. I can't imagine. I'm sure that must be the case in lots and lots of. We know it's the case in oil and gas. We know it's the case in
heavy regulated,
in all kinds of areas, right? So it is. Maybe this is a sad thing, but it is. You can't ignore it anymore. You got to kind of know who loves you, who hates you, and why, or what. Maybe more pernicious is just sort of, what good thing does somebody want to do at the legislative level, but they're not thinking through what the implications could be for a particular industry? And are you discounting that properly as you think about the value and the opportunities ahead of you?
Yeah. From the data room side, the highly regulated spaces, we are seeing, right? It's right. So, this has all been great. I've enjoyed our discussion. I've enjoyed our discussions prior that we've had building up to this as well. I'm really excited about having you at some point back on the podcast, but let's get to know you a little bit just on a personal side. Out of genuine curiosity, where did this interest come from, right? You've been in it for a while, 25 years, some great colleges. Like, where did this interest come from?
It's funny. Asking me to talk about myself is always dangerous. When I got out of business school, I really wanted to work internationally. And so that was the only thing I really cared about. And I managed to find a job opportunity with Time Inc. in Hong Kong. And I went to Hong Kong, worked for Time Inc. And so I got to know the magazine business and met my wife there. We came back to the US and I was sort of looking around and I thought I'd like to be involved in equity research. I think that would really suit me and my strengths. And it turned out that the publishing analyst had an opening and I had this background in publishing. And so that was it. So my first job on Wall Street was basically covering newspaper stocks and magazine stocks. There were a few of those. And then educational publishers. And what happened to me was that, as the educational services companies came public, my employer said, well, we don't really know what to do with these stocks. Let's put them together with these educational publishers. Right. And so I just sort of found myself, although I had this background in publishing and I was covering publishing stocks, I started to get to know these education stocks more and more. And that just really electrified me for all the reasons I've described. They were so much more interesting than newspaper stocks. Now, it's a good thing I didn't make my career in newspaper stocks because that turned out not to be a good way to go. But yeah, no, I sort of fell in love with the education sector at that point and just sort of devoted myself to it ever since. And I've always been, narrowly focused on education. And I was fortunate enough to have a pretty good run as an analyst. And then I was really fortunate enough to find Tyton Partners, which is focused exclusively on that same area, right? Everything from early childhood through K-12, post-secondary and corporate and continuing ed. And I really found my home. And so I sort of reinvented myself as an M&A banker after having been an analyst, but it's kept me in this sector that I really love. So
That's
been
awesome.
good.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
It's good to find a good fit like that. Let's go back to K through 12. I want to know, Trace, in K through 12, were there any examples that you can reflect back on how you were, like, for instance, for myself, through high school, I was in leadership classes because I knew I wanted to lead. I knew I wanted to run businesses. I didn't know that then, but I know that now. And I reflect back, I was like, wow, I was always that curious kid too. Why does this do that? Why does that do that? Do you have any early signals where you're like, you reflect back and you look at your early K through 12 and you're like, yeah, I see exactly why I'm where I'm at?
Well, again, this is a little weird talking about myself like this, but yeah, no, I always like to write. Right. And that's sort of what ultimately drew me to being a research analyst, because basically that job, there are a million ways to be a good research analyst. Some people are really, really good at modeling, stock picking, sales. And you have to have all those skills to be a good equity analyst, but also writing, right? You have to persuade people through the written work. And I love that part of it. That was something that had always been part of who I am. So I found a way to be a writer, but also work on Wall Street. It was pretty great. I love that. That was great. Like I said, I fell in love with education and then just kept going. So I still try to write when I can. It's not really a job. An M&A banker doesn't really have a lot of opportunities to write, but that's why I do sort of the white papers and the different things. I'm fortunate enough to know a bunch of people at different think tanks who think about education policy. And occasionally I get an opportunity to kind of write about something that I know about, right? So this area of basically the intersection of profit, sort of business and investors seeking returns, and that where that world intersects with education is kind of my jam, right? So that's sort of what's kept me in it. But yeah, so I still get to write, not as much as I did when I was an analyst, but that theme stays.
Well, I could tell your face lights up when you're talking about it. So I could tell you're genuinely passionate about what you're doing and who you're doing it for. It sounds like a really good marriage. With all that being said, tell us, how do people get in touch with you? How do they find you? Why should they find you? Let's give our audience a way to get in touch with you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So Tyton Partners has two professional services practices, both focused on education. We have a strategy consulting group that's based in Boston. They do a lot of growth strategy. That's also the place where for investors that are investing in education and need commercial diligence. That group does commercial diligence on behalf of investors. And then we have a investment banking practice based in New York. Although I'm not in New York, I'm in California, but most of the team is based in New York. And we do, we're sort of lower middle market focused. We deal with a lot of owner operators, entrepreneurs, family businesses, which is very common in education. And we do about, I'd say, maybe 85% sell side transactions where we're helping people sell companies or institutions in some cases, probably about 10% buy side where we're helping investors that are looking or operators that are looking for specific assets, find them. Then sort of 5% miscellaneous kind of capital raise projects and different things that we do. But that's it. We're at tytonpartners.com. It's TYTON partners.com. And all of our contact information and bio is there on the website. I'm just Urdan at tytonpartners.com. And our phone numbers are there. You can just call.
We'll drop all your contact details as part of the podcast episode when it drops for sure. Well, listen.
Yeah, so what I like to tell people is, listen, between the two practices, between our banking practice, which I think makes the strategy consultants a little bit more street smart, and the consulting practice, which makes our banking practice a little bit more kind of thoughtful and deep. But there really is no theme within that broad world of education that we haven't touched in some way. And we love to help people out. So if you're an investor interested in investing in this sector, if you're owning a business and you want to think about what the opportunities look like to sell, give us a call. We love to talk about this stuff, and we're happy to try to help you out, even if there's not necessarily business to do today.
Perfect. Well, we appreciate that, Trace. Our listeners are going to enjoy this conversation. I just know it. It's a unique perspective on a sector that doesn't get a lot of attention on the podcast more specifically. So thank you so much. There's a lot that and I say this in every podcast, there's a lot that we didn't unpack here. 45 minutes, an hour is just not enough to dive into all three topics in depth. So I would welcome you back on another episode in the near future where we can maybe dive a layer deeper for those listeners who are really wanting to get to that next level of information. But with all that being said, generally, thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you, Stephen. It was really fun. So I appreciate it.
Definitely. Well, that's a wrap on another episode of This Is M&A. I look forward to seeing all my listeners on the next episode. Until then, remember, stay sharp and stay deal ready.
If this episode sharpened your thinking, share it, post your take, follow the show, or drop a quick review and bring it into your next deal. We'll be back with more real talk from people who've been in the room when it counted. The views and opinions expressed on This Is M&A are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect the views of any company or organization mentioned. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, financial, or investment advice. Always consult a qualified professional before making business decisions.